He's supposed to be dead, but I'm staring right at him through my front window. My wife screamed the moment she saw him. Not a normal scream, not fear. It was recognition. And in that instant, everything I believed about my marriage stopped making sense. Because the man standing outside our home wasn't just some stranger watching us. He was the man my wife told me she buried years ago. Her dead husband. I was 40. A stable job, quiet life. Nothing dramatic ever really happened to me until I met her. She was 38. Warm, composed, a woman who had already lived a full life before me. She told me early on she had been widowed. Her husband died young, sudden tragedy, closed chapter. Or so I believed. We didn't rush. We built something slow, careful, intentional. She had a teenage son from her previous marriage. I had no issue with it. We became a blended family the way people hope it will go in movies. Awkward at first, then comfortable, then almost normal. Tonight was supposed to be another one of those normal nights. Family dinner. Her relatives over. Laughter in the kitchen. Plates clinking. The soft illusion of a life that finally felt settled. But there was one thing I didn't notice at first. My wife kept glancing out the window. Not casually. Like she was waiting for something she didn't want to arrive. It was 1947 when I caught the pattern. Every 4 or 5 minutes her eyes moved toward the glass. A quick flick, then back to the table. Her fingers stayed steady on the wine glass, but the knuckles tightened slightly each time. I stood up to clear some plates. From the sink I had a clearer angle. The driveway was empty under the porch light. No cars, no movement. Just the quiet suburban street and the faint glow from neighboring houses. She smiled at her sister's joke. The smile reached her mouth but not her shoulders. At 23, the doorbell rang. No one had mentioned any late guests. Her relatives exchanged quick looks. She rose before anyone else could move, smoothing her dress with both hands. Her steps toward the front door were measured, almost too even. I followed a few paces behind, carrying an empty serving bowl as an excuse. The hallway felt narrower than usual. The air cooler. She opened the door. A man stood on the porch. Mid-40s, maybe. Tall, lean, wearing a dark coat that didn't quite fit the mild evening. His face carried the kind of stillness that comes from long habits of control. He looked at her first, then past her shoulder, straight at me. She didn't introduce him. Instead, she stepped slightly to the side, letting the hallway light fall across his features. There was something familiar in the line of his jaw, in the way he held his posture. Something I had seen before in family photos, but never in color, never breathing. He spoke her name once, low, not like a stranger. Her hand stayed on the doorframe. The knuckles were white now. I set the bowl down on the side table. It made a soft click against the wood. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Outside, another car door shut quietly in the distance. No headlights. Just the soft thud of a second arrival. She still hadn't turned to look at me. The man on the porch took one slow step forward, crossing the threshold without being invited. His eyes never left mine. And in that moment I understood the window glances had not been about waiting for him. They had been about waiting for me to notice. It started with a knock that never came. Instead, there was just movement outside. A man standing across the street under the streetlight at 2012. Still, watching the house. At first I assumed it was nothing. Wrong house. Lost delivery guy. Maybe someone waiting for a ride. The kind of shadow you dismiss in a quiet neighborhood. But then I saw my wife's face change. She froze mid-reach for the salt shaker. Her glass slipped an inch in her hand, wine trembling at the rim. She set it down too carefully, fingers lingering on the stem. She whispered something under her breath I wasn't supposed to hear. I turned toward her. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she walked toward the window like she was pulled there against her will. Her steps were slow, measured, as if each one cost her something. The moment she saw him clearly, she backed away like she'd been physically struck. One step, then another, until her hip hit the edge of the dining table. A fork clattered to the floor. That's when things got worse. Because she didn't just recognize him. She looked terrified of him. Her breathing changed. Shallow. Controlled on the surface, but her shoulders rose and fell in short, sharp motions. She kept one hand pressed flat against the wall behind her as if needing something solid to stay upright. I moved closer to the window myself. The man hadn't shifted. Same posture. Hands in the pockets of his dark coat. Face half hidden by the angle of the light. But the silhouette felt wrong. Too familiar in the wrong way. He tilted his head slightly. Not toward the house. Toward her. At 20:15, a second figure appeared at the far end of the street. Same build. Same deliberate stillness. He stopped under the next lamppost and lit a cigarette. The flame briefly lit his face before he turned it away. My wife's hand found my arm. Not gently. Her grip was iron, nails pressing through my sleeve. She didn't pull me back. She held me in place, as if afraid I might step forward. Her relatives continued clearing plates in the kitchen, voices low and unaware. The clink of dishes felt distant, muffled, like it belonged to another evening entirely. The first man took one slow step off the curb, then stopped again. He was testing something. She finally tore her gaze from the window and looked at me. Her eyes carried a weight I had never seen in the 2 years we had been together. Not fear alone, something heavier. Recognition mixed with dread. Outside, the second man began walking. Not toward us. Parallel. Along the opposite sidewalk, keeping perfect distance. I reached for the curtain cord without thinking. Her grip tightened harder, stopping my hand. She shook her head once. Small, almost imperceptible. Then she glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms where her son was supposed to be finishing homework. The man across the street finally moved again. This time he crossed halfway into the road and stood directly under the brightest patch of light. For the first time, I saw his face clearly, and I understood why her glass had nearly fallen. He looked exactly like the man in the framed photo on our mantelpiece. The one she said had died 12 years ago. Only he wasn't dead. He was staring straight into our dining room window at 2017, and he was smiling. I went outside, not calmly. Instinct took over the moment her face drained of color. The front door clicked shut behind me at 2019. Cool night air hit my skin as I crossed the lawn. The man stood just beyond the property line under the streetlight. Mid-40s. Unremarkable clothes. But his posture carried the kind of rooted patience that made the street feel smaller. He didn't move when I approached. His eyes stayed fixed on the house behind me. I stopped 6 feet away. The silence stretched. He finally shifted his gaze past my shoulder, straight toward the lit doorway, where my wife now stood framed in light. Then he spoke, voice low and even. His words landed like a slow blade. I felt my stomach tighten. Inside the house, chairs scraped against the floor. Soft footsteps moved quickly. Tension thickened the air even from out here. I asked again, sharper. He exhaled slowly, almost tired, as if the conversation had already exhausted him years ago. And then he said the sentence that made the air feel thinner. I turned back toward the house. My wife stood in the open doorway at 2021, white as paper. One hand gripping the frame so hard the wood creaked. Her whole body trembled in small, barely visible waves. She whispered something again, the same broken sound from earlier. That's when the first real crack appeared in everything I thought I knew. I stepped between them, blocking his line of sight. He finally met my eyes directly. Calm. Unblinking. And delivered the second sentence that split the evening open. Silence followed. Heavy. Crushing. The kind that pressed against the ears. My wife collapsed into the nearest chair inside. Her legs simply folded. She caught herself on the table edge, knuckles white, breath coming in controlled bursts. But I wasn't done. I pressed him again. He answered without raising his voice. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. My wife wasn't just afraid. Her eyes kept darting between him and me with something heavier layered underneath. Guilt. The kind that had been carried for years and suddenly had nowhere left to hide. At 2023, she rose again, moved to the window with stiff, mechanical steps. She reached for the curtains and began to pull them shut, as if the truth could be blocked out with a piece of fabric. The man watched her do it. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. She yanked harder. The ring scraped along the rod. He took one slow step forward, now fully on our side of the property line. Her hands froze mid-pull. The curtain hung half-closed, leaving a narrow gap. Through that gap, I saw the second man from earlier. He had crossed the street and now stood at the edge of the driveway, closer than before. Watching. Waiting. The first man spoke once more, quieter this time. His words weren't loud, but they carried clearly across the short distance. And in that moment I realized the disappearance wasn't the only secret she had kept. Because he mentioned a name I had never heard her say. Not once in 2 years. A name that belonged to her son. Then he looked straight at me and added the detail that changed the weight of every quiet evening we had ever shared. He thinks I'm dead too. My wife finally let the curtain fall completely shut at 2025. But it was too late. The gap had already let everything in. We ended up inside. Against every better judgment. The relatives had already left by 2038, slipping out with uneasy glances and quiet excuses. The dinner plate sat untouched on the table. The house felt smaller, walls pressing inward as the three of us stood in the living room. The man took the armchair without being offered. My wife remained near the doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest. I stayed standing. Piece by piece it came out. He wasn't just alive. He had faked his death 12 years ago. Not for peace. Not for a fresh start. For escape from something he refused to name at first. His hands rested flat on his knees, fingers perfectly still. At 2041 my wife finally spoke, voice barely carrying across the room. He corrected her calmly, without raising his tone. That's when the real twist landed. He hadn't been a victim of some random tragedy. He had been involved in something dangerous, criminal, dark enough that vanishing entirely had been the only exit. He mentioned money moving through accounts that no longer existed, names that made my wife's shoulders stiffen. And my wife wasn't just the grieving widow I had married. She had helped build the story, helped bury the paperwork, helped erase him from every official record. Then she had rebuilt her life on top of that lie with me. My marriage didn't start after death. It started after a disappearance I was never supposed to question. At 2044 he leaned forward slightly. The lamp cast hard shadows across his face. He revealed she had known the plan from the beginning. She had chosen the date. She had driven him to the bus station at 3 a.m. one October night and never looked back. I wasn't even the second chapter. I was the cleanup. She moved then, crossed to the side table and poured herself a glass of water with hands that no longer shook. Too steady now. Practiced. The kind of control that comes from years of maintaining the same story. He watched her drink, then added another layer. The disappearance hadn't been clean. There were loose ends. People who had lost money. People who remembered faces. People who had started looking again recently. That was why he had returned tonight. Not for her. Not for the son sleeping upstairs. For the one thing she had kept hidden even from him all these years. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, then back to her. She set the glass down too precisely. The bottom made a soft click against the wood. At 2047 the second man from the street finally stepped into view through the narrow gap in the curtains. He remained outside but closer now. Leaning against our car. The first man didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Instead he spoke again, quieter, directing the words straight at my wife. He mentioned an account. A safety deposit box. A key she had never turned over. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. I realized then that the lie wasn't just about a dead husband. It was about what they had taken with them when he disappeared, and what she had continued to protect long after she had married me. The man stood up slowly at 2049. He didn't move toward the door. He simply looked at both of us and left one final detail hanging in the air between us. The son upstairs wasn't the only child he had left behind. Then he walked toward the hallway. My wife stepped forward to block him, but her eyes betrayed her. They weren't filled with fear anymore. They were calculating how much longer the lie could still hold. Everything after that became unstable. Every sentence felt like a trap. The living room air grew thick, heavy with words that refused to settle. I stood near the bookshelf at 2052, watching both of them. My wife kept her arms wrapped around herself. The man remained seated, legs crossed, hands resting loosely on the armrests. I asked her why she never told me. She couldn't answer directly. Just fragments slipped out in short, broken breaths. She stared at the floor, then at the window, then at nothing. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve until the fabric stretched. The man kept pushing harder. Not loud, not aggressive. Worse. Calm and controlled, like someone who had already replayed this exact moment in his head 1,000 times. Each word landed precisely measured. At 2055 he shifted forward in the chair. And then he said something that changed the temperature in the room. He looked straight at me. The fear shifted again. This wasn't just a reunion or an old secret surfacing. It was exposure. He had been hiding for 12 years in places he wouldn't name. Now something or someone had forced him back into the open. He mentioned a letter delivered to a false address. A single photograph left under a windshield wiper. Small signs that had grown impossible to ignore. My wife started shaking more violently now. Not at him. At the implication. Her shoulders jerked in small, involuntary movements. She pressed her back against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. Her breathing stayed shallow, controlled on the surface but fracturing underneath. Because if he had been found, then whoever found him might still be looking. And they would follow the trail he had left behind. He didn't flinch when he added the next piece. The people searching for him weren't old business partners or angry clients. They were patient, professional. The kind who waited years for loose ends to surface. He had changed his name 3 times, changed countries once. Still, they had gotten close enough to send a message. I realized something chilling in that moment. I hadn't just married a widow. I had stepped into a story that was never finished. It was still active. At 20:58, the second man outside finally moved. His silhouette passed slowly across the gap in the curtains. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, visible for 3 full seconds before stepping back into shadow. My wife noticed too. Her head snapped toward the window. For the first time, she looked smaller, as if the house itself offered no protection anymore. The man in the armchair continued speaking, voice never rising. He revealed he had returned not only because of the watchers, but because one final detail had surfaced. Something my wife had kept even after building this new life. A detail tied to the night he had supposedly died. A detail that could pull all 3 of us under if it broke open. She took 1 step toward him, then stopped. Her hand reached out halfway before dropping back to her side. He stood up at 21:1. Slow, deliberate. He looked between us both, then let his gaze settle on the hallway leading upstairs where her son still slept. The unfinished part wasn't just about money or old crimes. It was about what they had done together the night he disappeared. And who else had been there? The second man outside lit another cigarette. The brief orange glow illuminated his face just long enough to show he was watching the upper windows now. My wife followed his gaze. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do in the entire time I had known her. She reached for the light switch and turned off the living room lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. But the street light from outside still cut through the curtains. And in that narrow beam of light, the man who was never supposed to exist took 1 step closer to me. He whispered the last thing before the chapter closed. They already know where you live. The breaking point came at 21:4. He leaned forward in the armchair and spoke the words that finally cracked the room open. You think I came here to ruin your life? He let the pause stretch. I came because your life is already on their radar. Her knees gave out. This time there was no performance, no control left. She dropped straight into the chair behind her, hands gripping the armrests so hard the fabric bunched under her fingers. Her breathing turned ragged for the first time all evening. She admitted it. Not everything, but enough. There had been an arrangement. A carefully staged disappearance. A constructed identity shift. Money moved through offshore accounts. Protection bought in cash. Silence paid for in years of distance. She spoke in short, clipped fragments, eyes fixed on the carpet. But something had gone wrong recently. Someone had started asking questions. Old names resurfaced. Records that should have stayed buried were being pulled, and the only loose end left was her. And by extension, me. I felt it hit in layers. Not just betrayal. Replacement. I wasn't her new beginning. I was her hiding place. A quiet, stable man with no past entanglements. Someone whose ordinary life provided perfect cover. And now that hiding place was being exposed. The ex-husband finally said it plainly at 21:7. You were never meant to find me. He looked directly at her. But they found me anyway. In that moment, I realized the worst part wasn't the lie. It was that the lie had worked perfectly for years. Until now. She reached for the glass of water again, but her hand stopped halfway. Instead, she pressed her palms flat against her thighs, trying to steady them. The second man outside had moved closer. His shadow now cut across half the front window. At 21:9, the ex-husband stood. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the framed photo of their wedding day. The one where he was supposed to be dead. He turned it over in his hand once, then set it back down facing the wall. She watched him do it without moving. He added another piece without raising his voice. The people looking for him weren't interested in revenge alone. They wanted what had been taken the night he disappeared. Something small enough to carry, valuable enough to kill for. She had kept it. Even after marrying me. Even after building this house and this family. I looked at her then. Her eyes met mine for less than 2 seconds before sliding away. The ex-husband continued. He mentioned a safety deposit box in another city. A key that had never been returned. A contingency plan they had agreed upon years ago that she had quietly altered. At 2111, the power in the house flickered once. Then again. The lights dimmed but held. The second man outside was no longer visible through the curtains. That absence felt heavier than his presence. The ex-husband turned toward the hallway that led upstairs. He didn't walk toward it. He simply stood facing that direction, listening. She rose slowly from the chair. Her steps were unsteady as she positioned herself between him and the stairs. He spoke one final time, voice almost gentle. The loose end wasn't only her anymore. It was the boy upstairs who carried both their names. And whatever she had hidden inside this house to keep the old life from touching the new one. I took one step toward the window at 2113. Outside, the street looked empty again. But in the far distance, headlights appeared at the end of the block. They moved slowly, deliberately, not stopping at any other house. My wife followed my gaze. Then she did the one thing that confirmed how deep the unfinished story ran. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small metal key, and closed her fist around it so tightly the edges cut into her palm. The ex-husband noticed. For the first time that night, his calm expression fractured. Just slightly. Just enough to show that even he didn't know everything she had kept hidden. What followed wasn't closure. It was containment. No one slept that night. The house stayed lit until well after midnight. At 0:17 he made the first call from the kitchen, back turned, voice low and steady. By 0:43 a second call followed from the hallway. Names I had never heard were spoken quietly into the phone. Each one landed like a small weight dropped onto the floor. Arrangements shifted. Plans changed. My wife moved through the rooms like a ghost. She checked every lock twice. She stood at the upstairs window at 1:22, staring down at the empty street. Her hands never stopped moving, straightening the picture frame, folding a dish towel, touching the small key still clenched in her pocket. At 2:09 he stepped outside for 10 minutes. When he returned, his coat was buttoned differently and his hands were empty. He said nothing about where he had gone or who he had met. By morning, the man who had been standing outside our home was gone again. Not explained, not resolved, just removed. Like he had never been there at all. The driveway sat empty at 6:55. No footprints in the dew. No cigarette butts on the curb. Only the faint smell of smoke lingering near the porch. But the damage stayed. My wife and I didn't argue. We didn't reconcile. We simply existed in the same space with a truth neither of us could fully look at. She made coffee at 7:10. I poured mine seconds later. We passed each other in the kitchen without a word, careful not to touch. At 7:40 her son came downstairs. She smiled at him the same way she always did. Too perfectly. The boy ate cereal while scrolling on his phone, unaware of the new silence wrapped around the table. I watched her hands as she washed the dishes. The small key was no longer in her pocket. It had disappeared sometime between 3:00 and dawn. At 8:15 I stepped outside to check the mailbox. The street looked ordinary again. A neighbor waved from across the road. I waved back. When I turned to go inside, I noticed fresh tire marks on the asphalt directly in front of our house. Wide, heavy, not from any car we owned. Inside, my wife stood at the living room window again. Same spot as the night before. She held the curtain open with 2 fingers and stared at those tire marks for a long time. She didn't close the curtain when she finally stepped away. Instead, she walked to the mantelpiece and turned the framed wedding photo back around. The man in it stared out with the same calm expression he had worn last night. At 8:27, she placed the small metal key on the table between us. It sat there, dull under the morning light. Neither of us touched it. The ex-husband had left something else behind. A single folded note under the edge of the key. No writing visible on the outside. She didn't open it. She simply stared at it as if the paper itself could still speak. I realized then that containment wasn't the same as safety. The house felt quieter than it had in years. But the silence carried weight now. And somewhere out on the street, a dark sedan drove past slowly at 8:31. It didn't stop. It didn't speed up. It simply passed once, then circled the block again 5 minutes later. My wife saw it too. She picked up the key and slipped it back into her pocket without a word. Then she looked at me for the first time since midnight. Her eyes held a question she still hadn't answered. How much longer the new life could remain hidden inside the old one? I used to think marriage was about building something together. But I learned something else. Sometimes you're not building a life. Sometimes you're inheriting a story already in motion. And you don't get to choose whether you're a partner in it. Only whether you notice when the truth starts watching you from outside the window. Because in the end, the dead aren't always gone. Some of them are just waiting for the right moment to come back.